If you take away tariffs, we could end up being a third-world country. That was Donald Trump's grim warning, a line that can now be read as a reluctant admission of a collapsing strategy. The Federal Court of Appeals had already ruled his sweeping tariff orders illegal, and the U.S. Supreme Court seemed poised to uphold that decision. What began as a bold trade war now threatened to become a humiliating retreat, with Washington staring down the nightmare of refunding more than $210 billion in collected tariffs to Ottawa. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, this was no sudden windfall. It was the final stage of a carefully executed long-term strategy, one that seized America's weakness and rewrote the power dynamics of North America in Canada's favor. The unraveling of U.S. tariff policy wasn't random. It was the inevitable consequence of Trump's disregard for economic law, legal limits, and basic strategic calculation. The first, and perhaps most fatal misstep, was treating Canada like a junior partner instead of the sovereign powerhouse it actually is. Trump once tossed off the line that Canada should just become our 51st state. That mindset, seeing Ottawa as subordinate rather than equal, triggered a cascade of reckless decisions. From half-baked digital services taxes to dubious claims over steel dumping, Washington kept grasping for justifications. But the numbers didn't lie, and the excuses crumbled under scrutiny. The second structural blunder was ignoring just how deeply the U.S. and Canadian economies are fused together. You don't slap broad tariffs on the country that supplies 63% of your crude oil imports and anchors your auto supply chain without hurting yourself. Data from the Congressional Research Service made the reality crystal clear. In 2024, Canada was America's second-largest trading partner, with U.S. exports to Canada hitting $349 billion and imports topping $413 billion. Cutting into that relationship wasn't leverage. It was self-sabotage. The blowback hit fast. Instead of Canadians footing the bill, it was American businesses left bleeding. The so-called ricochet effect hammered U.S. companies across manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. By late August, the U.S. government had already collected $210 billion in tariffs, almost entirely from its own firms. And now the courts were demanding it give that money back. Legally, the problem was devastating. The appeals court ruled that invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, to justify tariffs was an abuse of executive power, far beyond what the law allowed. In plain terms, Trump had overreached, and the courts were calling him out. What began as an international trade war had morphed into a domestic constitutional crisis, a direct challenge to the belief that executive orders could bulldoze past legislative checks and balances. It was a crushing blow to Trump's worldview. While Washington flailed, Canada played the long game. Carney never matched Trump's volatility with emotion. Instead, Ottawa pursued a multi-layered strategy, containing immediate damage, positioning Canada for the future, and waiting for the moment America's overreach would collapse under its own weight. The labor market in the U.S. only added fuel to the fire. The JOLTS report showed fewer job openings than job seekers, less than one per person. Trump's response? He fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Rather than addressing the crisis, he chose to attack the messenger. It was a glaring signal of weakness. Instability deepened, confidence evaporated, and businesses began bracing for worse. Meanwhile, Carney projected calm and control. Asked by Canadian reporters about the U.S. talks, he didn't dodge or overpromise. Instead, he doubled down on Canada's leverage. Right now, we have the best trade deal of any country in the world. We think it can be better, and we're working to make it better. This wasn't bluster. It was strength wrapped in patience. The strategy came into sharp focus with Ottawa's asymmetric responses. Canada rolled back tariffs on some U.S. consumer goods, handing Trump a token win. But on strategic industries, steel, aluminum, energy, the tariffs stayed firmly in place. It was a surgical move, giving Trump just enough to drag him back to the negotiating table while exposing the dead end his policies had reached. At the same time, Canada pushed forward with structural changes. Recognizing America's volatility, Carney launched a trade blackout, a deliberate pivot away from overdependence on U.S. markets. Under Team Canada, new trade deals were aggressively pursued across Europe and Asia. Exports to the U.S. dropped, while shipments elsewhere surged. Canada wasn't just playing defense anymore, it was building a new economic architecture. And in the shadows, Ottawa prepared its ace: resources. Canada's hydroelectric power drives U.S. industry. Its uranium keeps America's nuclear reactors running. Its oil and critical minerals underpin entire supply chains. Trump may have wielded tariffs as his hammer, but Canada quietly held the nails holding America's house together. The stage was set for the decisive moment: the Supreme Court's ruling that could strip Washington of its tariff weapon for good. For Carney, this would be the legal and diplomatic breakthrough he had been waiting for. A U.S. defeat would mark the collapse of its coercive playbook, opening the door for Canada to launch its offensive phase. Reshaping the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, from a position of dominance, weaponizing its resources, and fast-tracking its global pivot. Carney's words on China captured the philosophy perfectly. We have differences, but they are our second-largest trading partner, and we will expand cooperation in ways that fit our values. The world's risky. We have to focus where we can enhance sovereignty and create opportunity for Canadians. Canada wasn't just surviving America's tariffs. It was preparing to rewrite the rules of the North American order. By the summer of 2025, the tariff battle was no longer just a trade dispute. It was a full-blown economic crisis eating away at the foundations of America's industrial base. Trump doubled down, signing an executive order on August 1, 2025, to raise tariffs on Canadian goods outside of USMCA from 25% to 35%. The move, confirmed by both Reuters and the Associated Press, took effect immediately. Prime Minister Carney called it deeply disappointing, stressing that the decision would hurt both sides. Dairy wasn't directly hit this time, but the sector was a long-standing flashpoint. For decades, Trump had raged against Canada's supply management system, calling it an unfair barrier shielding Canadian farmers while locking out U.S. producers. But the numbers told a different story. Canada's system, created in the early 1970s under the Farm Products Agencies Act, was designed to stabilize prices and protect small family farms from being crushed by American agribusiness giants. Imports were capped at 3.5 to 3.6% of the Canadian market. Go above that threshold, and tariffs soared: 241% on milk, nearly 298% on butter. That shield wasn't negotiable. Just weeks earlier, Canada's Parliament had passed Bill C-202, a law banning supply management from being used as a bargaining chip in trade talks. It passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, proving how politically untouchable the system was. For Trump, the issue became symbolic. For Canadian farmers, it was survival. The U.S. exported about $877 million worth of dairy to Canada each year, up from $525 million in 2021, while Canadian dairy exports south totaled just $300 million. Far from being locked out, U.S. producers were already selling more dairy into Canada than Canadians were selling into the U.S. But for Trump's political base, the optics mattered more than the math, and the dairy fight was only the tip of the iceberg. The auto sector, America's industrial crown jewel, was being pummeled by tariffs. In Michigan, the heart of U.S. car manufacturing, Trump's promise that tariffs would bring jobs back had crumbled into a nightmare. Instead of growth, the numbers showed collapse. General Motors lost $1.1 billion in Q2 2025 because of tariffs, warning total yearly losses could reach $4 to $5 billion. Stellantis, Jeep and Ram's parent company, posted a $2.3 billion loss in the first half of 2025, roughly $2.68 billion USD, with around $300 million directly tied to tariffs. Projections suggested total annual losses of $1.7 billion. Ford took an $800 million hit in Q2 alone, cutting its profit forecast from $7 to $8.5 billion down to $6.5 to $7.5 billion. Instead of strengthening Detroit, tariffs were draining it. Production costs soared, margins shrank, and factories faced layoffs. Consumers were next in line. The Center for Automotive Research estimated that the 25% tariff on cars and parts would pile an extra $18 billion in costs on the industry in 2025. That meant price hikes of $4,000 to $9,000 per vehicle, and as much as $12,000 on electric cars. Trump's logic collapsed under the weight of reality. On June 4, 2025, he had raised tariffs on imported steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%. Canada, America's largest aluminum supplier, providing 47% of imports, was hit hardest. By August, Canadian steel and aluminum outside USMCA faced an additional 35% tariff. On commodity markets, aluminum prices spiked to more than 70 cents per pound, nearly double May's level. The irony was brutal. The Ford F-Series, America's top-selling vehicle and a symbol of U.S. pride, relies heavily on aluminum from Quebec. Every tariff increase baked higher costs into America's own flagship product. Instead of weakening Canada, tariffs were weakening America's biggest brands. The fallout was massive. U.S. construction costs surged. Supply chains fractured. Consumers faced skyrocketing car prices. Auto companies warned they couldn't absorb the costs much longer. Independent researchers at Alex Partners estimated that once automakers hit the breaking point, they'd have no choice but to pass costs on to consumers. And when that day came, the pain would spread beyond boardrooms to working families. The damage rippled north, too. Canada, with auto and parts exports making up 27% of its total exports to the U.S., was hit hard. In April 2025, Canadian exports to the U.S. fell by 17.4%, with passenger cars and trucks dropping 22.9%. The trade deficit ballooned to a record $7.1 billion. By May, Canada's export share to the U.S. dropped from 78% to 68%, wiping out $7.7 billion, about $5.6 billion USD, in trade value. Factories cut shifts, lines slowed, and workers faced uncertainty. Yet Ottawa's strategy remained consistent: build long-term resilience, not short-term retaliation. Instead of knee-jerk countermeasures, Carney doubled down on diversification, expanding deals with Europe, the UK, and Australia. By mid-2025, Canada's exports to those markets had grown by more than 42%, but the cost of U.S. policy missteps was undeniable. Trust in cross-border supply chains was shattered. Analysts warned that if tariffs stayed in place, Canada's auto industry could undergo permanent restructuring, redirecting plants to Europe and Asia, while American buyers lost both leverage and supply. The once seamless North American auto chain, where car parts crossed the border multiple times before final assembly, was splintering into regional blocks. For workers on both sides, that meant fewer jobs, fewer opportunities, and an uncertain future clouded by instability. Detroit felt the burn hardest. Suppliers warned the administration, "You're burning all of our profit." The tariffs weren't just a trade strategy anymore. They were a self-inflicted wound, draining the lifeblood out of America's industrial heartland. By late 2025, The trade war had left Washington battered. The courts were closing in, businesses were reeling, and Trump's tariff-first strategy was unraveling. What had been sold as leverage was becoming America's most costly self-inflicted wound, and in Ottawa, Mark Carney was preparing to flip the script. The Canadian strategy wasn't reactive, it was calculated, deliberate, and patient. For years, Canada had been building toward this moment. Now, with the U.S. legal system poised to strike down the very foundation of Washington's tariff power, Carney was ready to launch the offensive phase. First came the USMCA. With the United States weakened by court rulings and financial chaos, Canada could demand safeguards it had never been able to secure before. Stronger protections for its industries, tighter dispute resolution mechanisms, and guarantees that Washington couldn't unilaterally weaponize tariffs again. America's ability to resist was collapsing, and Ottawa was preparing to take full advantage. Second, Canada moved to weaponize its strategic resources. The truth was undeniable. America couldn't function without Canadian energy and minerals. From hydroelectric power that kept U.S. industrial states running to uranium-fueling nuclear plants, Canada was indispensable. Ottawa's plan was to shift from reliable supplier to rule setter, demanding long-term investments and contracts that would establish Canada as the West's strategic mineral hub. Third, Canada would accelerate its global pivot. America's turmoil had become Ottawa's best marketing tool. By presenting itself as a stable, rules-based economy in a volatile world, Canada could fast-track trade deals with Europe, Asia, and beyond. The collapse of U.S. credibility would be Canada's opportunity to entrench its international standing. This wasn't theory. It was already playing out. In foreign policy, Carney showcased flexibility with China, refusing to let political differences block economic opportunities. "We have differences," he acknowledged, "but China is our second-largest trading partner. We will expand cooperation in ways that respect our values. The world's risky. We have to enhance sovereignty and create opportunities for Canadians." While Washington fired statisticians for delivering bad numbers, Canada tightened spending and invested in catalytic projects. Carney's domestic policy was clear: cut inefficiencies, rein in unsustainable spending, and create room for private investment. That stability at home became the backbone of Canada's strength abroad. Meanwhile, America's industries were buckling under pressure. In Detroit, the ripple effects were devastating. Steel and aluminum tariffs, piled on top of auto part duties, were threatening as many as 600,000 manufacturing jobs. Assembly costs spiked, dealerships faced shrinking sales, and families already squeezed by inflation were staring at car prices $4,000, $12,000 higher. The irony was impossible to ignore. The tariffs designed to protect American manufacturing were hollowing it out from within. Competitors in Europe and Asia were circling, offering cheaper cars and faster innovation, especially in electric vehicles. Trust in North America's once seamless supply chain was evaporating, and rebuilding that trust would take decades. Canada, however, was showing resilience. Yes, exports to the U.S. had dropped, and yes, factories were cutting shifts. But Ottawa was playing a long game. Ontario, the industrial front line, prepared for retaliation if needed. With more than 100,000 jobs tied to auto and steel production, provincial leaders signaled they could target vulnerable sectors of the U.S. economy: agriculture, chemicals, and machinery. And this was where the true danger lay for Washington. The deep interconnection between Detroit and Ontario, where parts crossed the border multiple times before a car rolled off the line, meant every shock was instantly felt on both sides. But Canada had a safety net: diversified trade with Europe and Asia, investments in long-term stability, and a government projecting calm instead of chaos. The U.S. had no such cushion. By doubling down on tariffs, Trump's administration cornered its own industries. Analysts warned that Ford, GM, and Stellantis could lose global competitiveness, not because of China, not because of Europe, but because of their own government's policies. The Supreme Court's looming ruling would not be the end. It would be the beginning of a new era. America's coercion-based foreign policy would be declared dead, and Canada would seize the chance to redefine the North American order. Carney summed it up in measured tones. Don't expect immediate white smoke on these strategic sectors, but the conversations are happening, and they will continue. Translation: Canada was no longer waiting for Washington. It was setting the agenda. Trump's tariffs were supposed to force Canada to bend. Instead, they forced Canada to transform into a stronger, more independent global player, less tied to American volatility and more capable of charting its own path. The balance of power had shifted. The once dominant United States was bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, and Canada, once dismissed as the quiet neighbor, was now leveraging patience, discipline, and strategy to rise as a decisive force in North America and beyond. What began as a tariff war had become something much bigger, a turning point. For the first time in generations, Canada wasn't just reacting to Washington, it was shaping the future of the continent.